the lecture portion of the evening, which is really exciting, because we have our local scholarly hero, Mr. Matt Krefting, saying a few things for us tonight. I'm going to try to keep his computer from falling asleep, and I don't know what else to say. Drink some wassail. Wassail. Matt, take it away.
Thanks, Neil. Is this loud enough? No. They say it's not loud enough, Neil. Even the gents in the front row. How's that? That's better. Well, I really want to say, first, I want to give a big thanks to Neil for putting together a sound poetry evening. Especially at the end of this particularly wretched year. It's a good way to see it out. So my lecture goes like this. That Neil printed out for me because I don't have a printer. All right. Jesus Christ. Gmail. It's a fucking miracle. No matter where you dip your toe in the story, sound poetry and its variants are always connected to movements and ideas that seek to revolutionize not only the arts, but life itself. Even the most politically uninterested sound poet is always only a few steps away from a project involving the most basic structures governing the forces of our lives. The structures upon which we're able to go about our day-to-day existence, the way we spend our time. While your toe is dipped in this bizarre murk, swirl it around a bit, and it won't be long before you're confronted with the spectacle of drunkenness. From the earliest practices to the most recent, this stuff has been the stuff of drunks. Look no further than tonight, the second to last day of this most foul year, 2009, and here we are, celebrating sound poetry in all its forms by gathering in a bar to drink and carouse. The simplest way to tell the story is to say that sound poetry was invented, for lack of a better word, by Dadaist and founder of the Cabaret Voltaire, Hugo Ball. While just about every figure involved in the early days of Dada claims to have founded the movement, or at least named it, Ball seems to be the only one claiming to have invented this new art of poetry without words. He writes in his diary, "The image of the human form is gradually disappearing from the painting of these times, and all objects appear only in fragments. This is one more proof of how ugly and worn the human continence has become, and how all the objects of our environment have become repulsive to us. The next step is for poetry to decide to do away with language for similar reasons. These are things that have probably never happened before. In these phonetic poems, we want to abandon a language ravaged and laid barren by journalism. We must return to the deepest alchemy of the word, and leave even that behind us, in order to keep safe for poetry its holiest sanctuary. It is this defense of poetry as something larger than language, larger than any petty earthly concerns, that moves me most deeply about this art form. One morning a few years ago, I awoke to find a piece of paper on which I had scrawled in the middle of the night, "Poetry is no longer words on a page or even actions. Poetry is the attitude with which one does something." This is perhaps the only thing I've ever written in my sleep, which is quite a bit at this point, that I think is worth a damn. On July 14th, 1916, at what is considered to be the first great evening of Dada performance, Ball, dressed in a brightly colored cardboard costume so bulky he had to be carried onto the stage, recited his first abstract poem, Ogaji Berry Bimba. His own description of the encounter is so beautiful that I will quote it once again. "The stresses became heavier. The emphasis was increased as the sound of the consonants became sharper. Soon I realized that if I wanted to remain serious, and I wanted to at all costs, my method of expression would not be equal to the pomp of my staging. I feared disgrace and pulled myself together. The heavy vowel sequences and the plodding rhythm of the elephant caravan had given me one last crescendo, But how was I to get to the end? Then I noticed that my voice had no choice but to take on the ancient cadence of priestly lamentation, the style of liturgical singing that wails in the Catholic churches of East and West. I do not know what gave me the idea of this music, but I began to chant my vowel sequences in a church style like a recitative, and tried not only to look serious, but to force myself to be serious. For a moment, it seemed as if there were a pale, bewildered face in my cubist mask. That half-frightened, half-curious face of a 10-year-old boy, trembling and hanging avidly on the priest's words in the requiems and the high masses of his home parish. Then the lights went out, as I had ordered, and, bathed in a sweat, I was carried down off the stage like a magical bishop. This sense of transcendence, which would later manifest itself in Ball in a disappointingly religious context, is evidence that the basic impulse leading to sound poetry is the impulse that would follow it throughout history. The desire to crack through, to actually get outside of language and into a new realm of expression. Yes, on the one hand it resembles the speaking in tongues that occurs from time to time in a church situation. But on the other hand, and perhaps more accurately, it resembles nothing so much as incoherent, drunken barking, the things one says in the midst of an awful, boozy blackout. But Ball wasn't looking for kicks, he was looking for alchemy. These initial incidents at the Cabaret Voltaire opened the door to two other major early sound poetry voices, Raoul Hausmann and Kurt Schwitters. Schwitters, of course, is the one behind the all-time classic Sonata, inventor of März, the bastard offspring of Dada, and creator of at least 3 versions of the infamous Märzbau, structures in his own homes built out of trash and art and crap that Schwitters found on the street. Kurt Schwitters is a goddamn hero if ever there was one. I lump these two together because they were friends and because Hausmann's poem Fugsbw would form the basis for Schwitters' Sonata. In his essential book, Dada, Art and Anti-Art, Hans Richter says, "No one could perform poetry as he could. Schwitters was a totally free spirit. He was ruled by nature. No stored-up grudges, no repressed impulses. Everything came straight from the depths, without hesitation, like Athena from the head of Zeus, ready-made, fully armed and never seen before." Richter's description of the first public reading of the Sonata, given at a party at Potsdam attended by retired generals and other individuals of rank, is too magnificent not to quote here. Schwitters stood on the podium, drew himself up to his 6 feet plus, and began to perform the Sonata, complete with hisses, roars, and crowings, before an audience who had no experience whatever of anything modern. At first they were completely baffled, but after a couple of minutes the shock began to wear off. I watched delightedly as 2 generals in front of me pursed their lips as hard as they could to stop themselves laughing. Their faces, above their upright collars, turned first red, then slightly bluish, and then they lost control. They burst out laughing, and the whole audience, freed from the pressure that had been building inside of them, exploded in an orgy of laughter. The dignified old ladies, the stiff generals, shrieked with laughter, gasped for breath, slapped their thighs, and choked themselves. Kurt was not in the least bit put out by this. He turned up the volume on his enormous voice to force 10 and simply swamped the storm of laughter in the audience, so that the latter almost seemed to be an accompaniment to the Sonata. The hurricane blew itself out as rapidly as it had arisen. Schwitters spoke the rest of his Sonata without further interruption. The result was fantastic. The same generals, the same rich ladies who had previously laughed until they cried, now came to Schwitters, once again with tears in their eyes, almost stuttering with admiration and gratitude. Something had been opened up within them, something they had never expected to feel, a great joy. Now, if you don't find that inspiring, you're made from different stuff than I, friend. In both of the instances I've described, Ball and Schwitters, literally drunk with the belief in their own work and its potential, created situations of total transcendence and transformation. Expectations were defied, the old was made new, and experience itself, if only for a moment, was revolutionized. Let's take 2 key phrases from this last paragraph and hop ahead a few years and over to France while we're at it. These 2 phrases are literally drunk in created situations. I'm speaking, of course, of our good friends, the situationists. It is here where the connection to drunkenness in its traditional sense becomes most pronounced. Despite the overwhelmingly quotable rhetoric of the Situationist International, for our discussion of sound poetry, it is probably best to stick with the SI's predecessor, the Letterist International. And what is letterism, you ask? Well, the first and probably only real letterist was a pompous ass named Isidore Isou. Isou believed that he had revolutionized poetry by distancing it further from the syllabic work of our aforementioned poets and moved the focus to the letter. He was soon overthrown by a young group of equally pompous but far more charming young men, led by Guy Debord and Gilles Volman. The group grew out of a ragtag bunch of drunks and thieves who had haunted Paris's left bank, and who prided themselves on the fact that they did absolutely nothing. Useless sods, the lot of them. The only thing they were any good at for years, other than theorizing about what was wrong with society, was getting bombed, throwing up, stealing more booze, and getting arrested for their drunken exploits. Debord was a serious theorist and a goddamn sponge for both literature and alcohol. Volman was perhaps the first sound poet to get to the crux of the whole fucking mess, the breath. Rather than some crappy, made-up nonsense language, Volman realized that the whole business revolved around the fact that air moved in and out of the body, producing sound. Simple, yet revolutionary. Volman's Magna Pumenes, I can't really pronounce that shit, would single-handedly set the stage for sound poetry in the latter half of the century, influencing, most notably, the greatest and most tireless advocate of the art form, Henri Chopin. The desire for the sort of transcendence described in the experience of Ball and Schwitters manifests itself as an aggressive frustration in Volman's work. Even his more mannered works always spill over into brutal spitting and growling. Jean-Michel Mencion, who was but a young thug when the group was assembling, is the author of an indispensable memoir of the era entitled The Tribe. And he describes Volman's work as very violent, very physical, using voice techniques to rather extraordinary effect. Volman would spring his work on unsuspecting cafe patrons, reportedly with such force that he would rattle windows and cause timid cafe owners to shut their doors for fear of disturbing the neighbors. While the group was living for 10 days aboard an enormous barge, Volman was elected God. There's no one else I'd want at the head of my life ship. The group also contained the magnificent and darned sexy Francois Dufresne. The sound poem is, like the very greatest of art, a magnificent space of fantasy and freedom. Sound poets remove the vibration of the vocal cords from the need to say anything in the traditional sense. It is with this in mind that I mention a project that the Letterist International developed, perhaps my favorite artistic endeavor of all time, the Dérive, a walk without purpose, or more accurately, a walk to nowhere. The object of the game here was to become lost, to lose one's bearings even in the most familiar of avenues. They dubbed this space psychogeography, to create real oblivion in real time. Needless to say, being drunk helps. I encourage anyone with any access to any sort of town to try this simple and mind-altering experiment. I have passed some wonderful hours, though not nearly enough, strolling around in places I once thought I was familiar with, and allowing time and occasionally drink to take me out of my patterns of movement and help me into a freshly new emotional space. I have often started off on these treks with the seeming weight of the world on my shoulders, only to find that the rolling of my feet came to disorient and ease my mind.
Did it? Maestro? Track one or?
Track one. Move poetry off of the page and into your throat. Move it into every breath you take. Move your breath down into your feet and lose yourself on streets you know inside and out. Notice something new about every building you pass. Watch the night turn to day as you drunkenly bob and weave down avenues of your own memory. Believe now, always, and spectacle at any time your heart desires. Sound poetry was invented and developed in bars. So tonight in this bar, let us all access those strange places within ourselves. The moments when sense stops mattering so much. Let's lose the need to control and invite real freedom in. Perhaps the most tragic figure of the Situationist movement was Gilles Ivan, or Ivan Chechiglov, author of the classic Formula for a New City. After a fight with his wife, she had him confined to an asylum, where he was given electroshock and insulin shock, and his mind was turned to a pile of mush. Years earlier, without knowledge of his fate, he wrote, "Oblivion is our ruling passion." And that's the largest commonality I can see between the impulse that leads to sound poetry and the impulse that leads to willful drunkenness. The desire for oblivion, the complete rejection of that which limits one's ability to express the interior emotional world. The desire to break so completely with traditionally accepted reality that the sound poet, or the drunk, or more often than not, the drunk sound poet, discovers entirely new aspects of personality and new means of expression. Language is so often so woefully ineffective at expressing nuances of feeling that for the sensitive person there is sometimes no option but to step right outside the lines and start looking for a new way. To quote Henri Chopin, happiness, anger, the expression of love that can be something other than the banal, "I love you," the light of a sound, the color of an eye, saying more than the word itself. It seems criminal not to talk about some of my other favorite sound poets, Bengt Emil Johnson, Sten Hansen, and I should probably be castrated for only briefly mentioning Chopin. But you know what? Fuck that. This is 2009, my least favorite year yet. And I'm just going to throw some more of my favorite quotes at you and call it a night. The Dadaist wages war against the agony of our age and its intoxication with death. Averse to any sage inhibition, he cultivates the curiosity that revels in even the most dubious form of rebellion. He knows that the world of systems has gone to rack and ruin, and that time, a dunning creditor, has started a rummage sale of godless philosophies. Hugo Ball. You've blown it all now. You'll never see the hacienda. It doesn't exist anywhere. The hacienda must be built. Ivan Chechiglov. I feel forces growing within myself. I am not afraid anymore to ask people for something. I know they aren't afraid to say no. Kurt Schwitters. People who talk about revolution and class struggle without referring explicitly to everyday life, without understanding what is subversive about love and what is positive about the refusal of constraints, such people have a corpse in their mouth. The Situationist graffiti. It is no longer a question of putting poetry at the service of revolution, but rather of putting the revolution at the service of poetry. Situationist International, Volume 8, 1963. And last but not least, and maybe most applicable to tonight, our cabaret is a gesture. Every word that is spoken and sung here says at least this one thing, that this humiliating age has not succeeded in winning our respect. Hugo Ball, April 14th, 1916. Thanks.
Thank you, Matt Krefting.
Thanks, Will.
Do you want questions or do you want to just keep moving?
If anybody has any questions, they can find me either at the back of the bar, just come over. Hey, come over to my house and we'll talk about this stuff all night.
Nice. He lives down the street. Not that anyone should know that. Thank you, Matt Krefting.
Come on.
Thank you, Rebecca.